Competency 1, the ESL teacher understands fundamental language concepts and knows the structure and conventions of the English language. The descriptors here talk about the basic concepts of language systems. This includes phonology, morphology, syntax, lexicon, semantics, discourse, and pragmatics. Also talks about the functions and registers of language, the interrelatedness of listening, speaking, reading, and writing, and the structure of the English language, including patterns and conventions of written and spoken English in accordance with the ELPS. The ELPS are the English language proficiency standards and do include some grammar. So for those of you who teach English, this is not usually an issue for you. If you teach the lower grades and you do language arts, you probably are familiar with many of these. If you are not, or you teach a content area, then this is going to be a competency that you will need to do more studying with because you won't be as familiar as some of the other people. So competency 1 is one of the longer competencies. Language is a lot of different things, but here are some characteristics of what language is. It's basically the ability to communicate, and you use symbols. It's basically universal. All languages have similarities. It's flexible and responsive, and it's personal. Although languages are very diverse, they also share many universal properties, and they are all systematic. We have lots of purpose for language, but once again, it's mainly communication and for different needs. It could be to ask a question, to inform someone, to interact. And the definition of language, there are many of them, but it's a set of arbitrary symbols, words, which are placed in an orderly relationship with one another according to conventions accepted and understood by the speakers for the transmission of messages. Basically, it's whatever is used to communicate in a culture. Language systems all have a sound system, a phonology. They have a word-forming system, which is called morphology. They have a phrase and sentence-forming system, which is syntax, and a vocabulary, which is often referred to as a lexicon. When we hear the word lexicon, often it's a certain type of vocabulary. So it could be like medical jargon or a certain type. But every language system has these components. There are levels of language, and the most basic level is phonology, the sounds. Morphology then puts sounds together to form words. Then semantics is the meaning of those words when put in a certain syntax. Syntax is word order. And then pragmatics has to do with how language is used in a situation. And we will talk more about these different terms. So there are different levels. Here are some descriptions of each of these words. With phonology, it's just the study of the system of sounds and how they're organized and used. The smallest unit of sound, or meaningful sound, is a phoneme. And we have phonetics, which is the study of the sounds of the human language. Phonics involves teaching children to connect sounds with letters or groups of letters. For example, the sound k, which is represented by those two lines with the small k in the middle, can be represented by various spellings. It can be the letter C, the letter K, or a CK. But the sound is the same and is represented that way. There's phonemic awareness, and that means the ability to deal explicitly with segmental sound units, smaller than a syllable. So when you sound out a word and the letter B is there and you say "b," that's phonemic awareness, okay? And so we teach that early on. Morphology is a system of how we build words using morphemes, okay? Semantics is the study of the meaning of words. So there are multiple meaning words. We're looking at semantics. Syntax is the way we organize words in a sentence, and that can vary from language to language. And then pragmatics is how you use language within a social context. So phonological awareness in the second language is sometimes difficult because students can't hear sounds they haven't encountered in their native language. So they have to hear the sound many times before they can really identify it. They must be taught then also to produce a specific sound. And in the glossary, there's some definitions for place of articulation and manner of articulation that really has to do with where you place your tongue while you're pronouncing words. So when you pronounce, for example, TH, th, your tongue is in between your teeth. So that's called interdental, okay? If you pronounce the B sound, buh, that's bilabial, okay, because your two lips are together. But it's also known for articulation, the manner is a stop because the sound is short and it stops, buh, okay? So there's different ways of articulating sound, both in the way you form your mouth, but also in the type of sound that you produce, whether it's open, closed, and you don't have to really know all the terms or anything on the glossary, but knowing that that's an important thing that students of other languages may need explicit instruction in, is pronunciation and how to make sounds. Here's some differences in phonological awareness and phonics. And we become phonologically aware much before we interact with print, is the main point here. We begin to sound out words and make sounds before we actually connect them to the written word. There are sound transfer issues depending on languages, certain consonants and vowel sounds that are not common. These are just some examples. Once again, the important thing is to know that if a sound is not in a person's native language, it may need to be explicitly taught to the student. Morphology combines morphemes, which is the smallest linguistic unit that has a meaning or a grammatical function. So it could be UN, okay, that's a prefix that goes in front of a word to change the meaning. So that's a morpheme. We combine phonemes into morphemes and morphemes into words, and then we combine words into sentences. Here's an example of changing the meaning of a word with the application of morphemes. So this study of morphemes gives students generalizations they can apply. For example, learning the prefix un or un is very helpful because then they can make the opposite or the negation of a word by putting that in front. So teaching prefixes and suffixes is very critical, and it's also similar in many languages. Many languages have prefixes and suffixes. They're just different, but the meanings are similar. So syntax is the order we put words in. We say we will go home after school, or we will go, after school we will go home. But we don't say after school to home we will go. But in other languages, that might be the correct word order. So if students are experiencing that, it's simply a matter of teaching them what the correct word order in English is. There's an example here. We say a big blue house. Why? I'm not really sure. But we don't say a house big blue or a blue big house, okay? Now, a house big blue might be appropriate if you're speaking Spanish because the adjective follows the noun. And so when you notice those kinds of things, it's easy to point that out. So there are categories of syntax, which are just the parts of speech. So if you haven't studied grammar in a while, this is where you can look at the grammar review that's provided in the course and maybe do a little extra studying because there will be a few questions probably that deal with grammar on the test. And we don't know what parts of speech they may choose. So at least knowing what a noun and a verb is, an adjective, adverb, preposition, interjection, conjunction, pronoun, and then these words, having a familiarity with them will be helpful to you. So syntax is concerned with what? Hopefully you said word order, because that is correct. A dependent or a subordinate clause written by itself would be it's a fragment, because it's dependent on either the subject or another part of the sentence to make it whole. Those were some examples. I mean, I don't believe that the questions are that, simplistic, but it gives you an idea of the type of thing that you should be able to identify. We'll see an example of those questions in the practice guide. Lexicon, once again, is a vocabulary of a person, language, or branch of knowledge. So musical terms, medical terms, so forth. But they are also the words used by a person or a group of people. Within language, we have cognates, words that in one or more language have a common origin. There are 3 levels of cognates: true, partial, and false. A true cognate is spelled the same and the meaning is the same. For example, in English, rumor and legal is spelled exactly the same as in Spanish, rumor and legal. So the difference is really in the pronunciation and the placement of the accent. And I apologize for my accent. It's probably not that great. Partial cognate will be similar. It's spelled from the same origin, but it's slightly different. It may have a different suffix or a prefix. For example, in English, fragrance, and Spanish, fragancia. The meaning's the same, the spelling's different, and the pronunciation's different. And the point here is that students won't always pick up on that. Okay, so if you hear someone saying fragancia, you might not pick up that that's the same word as fragrant. However, if you have a good vocabulary and you see that, you may be able to point that out. And there are cognates in more complex language and simpler language. For example, the younger students, lion and leon, or animal and animal, same idea. Occasionally there's false cognates. Those are words that look the same or maybe are spelled the same, but they do not mean the same thing. For example, exit in English is to leave. But in Spanish, when you see with an accent, éxito, that means success. So we don't want to put signs in our buildings that say éxito. I mean, you can wish people success, but they would not know that that was really an exit sign. Pragmatics versus semantics. Semantics is really only concerned with the meaning of actual words and their interrelations, whereas pragmatic takes into consideration the meaning that a speaker or listener may perceive. It's more perception than actual meaning. Here's a more in-depth definition of semantics. Semantics can include synonyms, antonyms, homonyms, and multiple meaning words. Pragmatics is also the meaning conveyed by a word depending on the context it's used. Okay, and this can be time, place, social relationship, and so forth. There are reasons for teaching the difference because new language learners, or ELs, have to start learning how to understand the pragmatic meaning of sentences in order to avoid miscommunications. One way to facilitate this is to teach them slang, phrases, idioms, and so forth. One example is we would say, crack the window, which really came from the time when we rolled the window down and you would just roll it slightly, crack the window. But if an ELL heard that, they might think you mean literally crack the window and not understand that. So that's an example of what we're talking about. Here's another situation. Can you pass the salt is really an order. No one expects you to say, no, I can't. Okay, it's not really a question. Likewise, do you mind is a question that you would say no when you really mean I'll do it, or yes. It's giving permission. So that's a little bit confusing. Or how about, oh yes, that's a great idea. That could be in earnest. Yes, that's a great idea. Or it could be very sarcastic. Oh yeah, that's a great idea, right? So it depends on the inflection. It depends on the situation. Think about texting. One of the difficulties when I began texting was, how do I read that? Was that serious? Was that sarcastic? What did they really mean? And so there's miscommunications that way. There's also these multiple meaning words. When we say ball, we know by the context of that sentence what that means, what type of ball that is. Idiomatic language, quit beating a dead horse, or it's raining cats and dogs. They're not literal, okay? But ELs, especially at the beginning level, are going to take everything you say, because they're trying to understand it, often literally, and will not understand these phrases. However, we don't want to avoid them. We want to explain them. And it's helpful if you ask them to share idioms from their own language, because they have them as well. An example would be in Dutch, they have, instead of roll out the red carpet, which we have for really making a show for someone important, they say put out the little flower pots, okay? And that means to them you're really preparing for a guest that you respect. Discourse is any kind of discussion. It could be verbal or written, but it's really formal. So when we say discourse, it's more of an academic type term. Discourse includes cultural rules for conversation. For example, taking turns and asking certain phrases at the beginning of conversations. We don't really write the way we speak, and it's very apparent in the way that we text. There are differences in how we speak or text and what we would do in a written response. There are also rhetorical patterns, ways that we order information. And not all languages are the same. Some languages are very linear. They say what they mean right up front. And other languages are what we call curvilinear, meaning they kind of come around to the point, okay? And that can be a personality thing, but it also can be a language type structure. So there are cohesive devices that help connect sentences together in a text and help with understanding of text. And so, of course, when misused, these can also cause misunderstandings. For example, pronouns, conjunctions, substitutions, and lexical cohesion. So, for example, pronouns are important because that's very confusing sometimes for people in languages. To misuse the pronoun, or let's say to not have the pronoun close to what we call the antecedent. So if I'm making a statement and I don't have the he or she or this or that near the actual object I'm referring to, then those sentences can be confusing. In conjunctions, things like then, therefore, afterwards, because, since, indicate some relation between the previous statement and the following statement, whether spoken or written. So that's important. And then making sure that our language is cohesive. In other words, it flows correctly. So here's another example of how the accent or the stress placement can cause a difference in meaning. In the 60s, we played records. They could be 45 records with 2 songs, one on the front, one on the back, or they could be LPs, which were albums. But we can also record someone speaking. For example, I'm recording this presentation for you. That makes a difference. Also, we have perfect, no mistakes or problems, and perfect, which is a verb, to refine something. So sometimes the stress placement can cause a difference in meaning, and that is true in other languages as well. For example, in Czech, stress is almost always on the first syllable. In French, it's typically on the last syllable, and in Spanish, usually on the second to last syllable. Now, there are exceptions, obviously, to these rules, and usually that causes an accent mark to be given. But these are just patterns that we see. Okay, language registers is what type of language you use in a social setting. So, for example, talking to your boss, you would be more formal, okay, talking to your superior, it's more standard type English. Casual or slang, talking to a friend, would be what we would refer to as informal or casual. And then we kind of have something called frozen, like everybody says the Pledge of Allegiance, pretty much the same, or happy birthday. Dialects are actually a variety of language defined by geographical factors and social factors such as class, religion, ethnicity. It can include differences in pronunciation, grammar, and semantics, but also in words. For example, a student can speak Spanish and be from Guatemala and have maybe some different pronunciations or even words than the Spanish that's spoken in Mexico or Spain or so forth. The standard dialect is considered the official dialect, and it's recognized in our dictionaries, printed works. It's really the language of education and people in power, and it's identified as correct. So listening, speaking, reading, and writing are also interrelated and essential. In other words, we learn these in conjunction, and they're necessary to practice and do all to become a fluent English speaker. So listening and reading are considered what we call receptive skills, meaning you receive the information, and speaking and writing are what we call the expressive or productive skills, meaning that you are at that point producing information, talking or writing. Listening and reading are what type of skills? Hopefully you just said receptive. How do we integrate these skills? Well, I think it's pretty automatic when we use authentic communication. When I'm talking to you, you're listening, and you respond, you're speaking. If I ask you to read something and then respond in writing, that's a reciprocal relationship. So these skills are reciprocal and they reinforce one another. So when we're teaching content, and by that I mean language arts, math, science, and social studies, we need to create opportunities that are meaningful and help students practice social and cognitive development. And that's through using language in all those domains, in all those skills. It's also helpful if we use real-life tasks, okay, that combine language with non-linguistic functions. In other words, using language, but also using non-linguistic functions, especially for the students that are at a low proficiency level. We want to focus on meaning and information gathering and so forth for all of our students. In your preparation manual, these are the questions that are under Competency 1. It's 1, 21, and 22, and 28, and actually they have number 10, which really is not addressed until Competency 7. So if you miss number 10, that's probably why. I think it's just an error on the test preparation manual. Here's another practice question. It would be most appropriate to use a formal language register in which situation? Take a look at those answers and decide. And really the only rational answer or correct answer is presenting at a town meeting. I hope this helped you in Competency 1, and I appreciate your attention.